Are you having a hard time figuring out what to get Dad for Father's Day? Shop now at sportshistorynetwork.com/row1 and save 15% off your order when you check out Row 1 Brand's Vintage Sports Pictorium Gallery. They have America's best sports art. With over 7,200 historic sports prints, you're assured to find something unique for Dad this Father's Day. If he's an NFL buff, check out the 1963 vintage NFL helmet poster. Shop now at sportshistorynetwork.com/row1.
This podcast is part of the Sports History Network, your headquarters for the yesteryear of your favorite sport. You can learn more at sportshistorynetwork.com.
Hello, sports fans, and welcome back to another edition of the Historically Speaking Sports Podcast. I'm your host, Dana Augusta, and this is the place where we celebrate the anniversaries of the greatest sports moments 1 week at a time. And this week, we will focus on the NBA primarily, where two of the most memorable moments in the history of that sport took place this week in history. Later in the podcast, we will also spotlight a certain team from the mid-1990s that had one of the greatest runs in NBA postseason history that didn't win a title, yet shocked the world. Also, we will revisit the most dramatic moment in the history of the NBA Finals, which was the catalyst of a team's first NBA title, and that is this week's main event. And so as a reminder, please subscribe to this podcast if you like what you hear here, and check out our Twitter page at HistoricallySP2. And now, on with the show. Now, this week's main event takes us back to 1970 and the NBA Finals of that year. The battle for that year's World Championship would feature two flagship NBA franchises from the two largest markets in the country. Of course, we're talking about the New York Knicks and the Los Angeles Lakers. Now, the Knicks, coached by Red Holzman, finished the regular season with a record of 60-22 and won the Eastern Conference title by beating a young and up-and-coming Milwaukee Bucks team that featured the likes of Lou Alcindor and Oscar Robertson. And the Knicks featured that year's league MVP, Willis Reed, along with future Hall of Famers in the likes of Walt Frazier, Bill Bradley, Dave DeBusschere, Dick Barnett, and Cassie Russell. Meanwhile, the Lakers entered the playoffs with a modest 46-36 mark, but they would find their stride in the postseason, sweeping the Atlanta Hawks in the Western Conference Finals 4-0. The Lakers had their usual cast of leading men. In fact, by the time of the NBA Finals, Wilt Chamberlain, Jerry West, and Elgin Baylor were the three leading playoff scorers in NBA history. And with an added twist of the finals will be both teams were hungry for championships. The Knicks were looking for his first NBA title in franchise history, while the Lakers were looking for his first one since moving to the West Coast in 1960. Because previous to that, of course, they were the Minneapolis Lakers. Now, after the first two games of the series, it was split 1 game apiece, with the scene shifting from the Madison Square Garden in New York City over to the Forum in Inglewood, California. Now, Game 3 will become an instant classic as both the Knicks and the Lakers were involved in a seesaw struggle throughout the game. The climax of the game came in the final seconds of regulation, with game tied at 100 points apiece, and Dave DeBusschere connecting on a 16-foot jumper to give the Knicks a 2-point lead with 3 seconds left in regulation. The Lakers, with no timeouts remaining, had to quickly inbounce the ball. Chamberlain passed it to Jerry West, who took 2 dribbles and heaved up a shot from beyond half court. Here's how Lakers radio announcer Chick Hearn described it.
Trying to pressure the inbounds pass, and it comes in to Walt Frazier with 10 seconds now showing on the clock. 8 seconds left to go on the clock. 7, 6, 5. DeBusschere shoots. Hit with 3 seconds to go. 2 seconds. 1 second.
Despite that dramatic shot at the end of regulation by Mr. Clutch, the Knicks would hold on and prevail in overtime 111-108 thanks to Willis Reed's 38 points. The Lakers would respond, however, in Game 4, evening the series with a 121-115 win, sending the series back to New York for Game 5 with the series tied at 2 games apiece. Now, the series would turn in the pivotal Game 5 back in Madison Square Garden. Now, with the Knicks holding a slim lead, disaster struck as Willis Reed, captain and MVP, would injure his leg as he tried to drive to the basket, trying to drive around Wilt Chamberlain. He suffered a torn abductor muscle, which essentially controls the ability to lift your leg when you take a step. Now, despite the absence of Reed, somehow the Knicks would knock off the Lakers in Game 5 and sending the series back to LA for Game 6 and needing just one more win to claim their first ever NBA title. Yet, it was not to be for the Knicks in Game 6. Without Reed to contain Chamberlain, Wilt would drop 45 points in a Lakers rout, setting up a Game 7 back in New York City. On May 8th, 1970, the final game of the series was named by ESPN in 2010 as the greatest Game 7 in NBA Finals history, in taking place of all places in the Mecca of basketball, Madison Square Garden. The big question surrounding the game was, would Willis play? As ABC television was in the middle of their pregame telecast, Reed appears out of the darkness of the tunnel that led to the Knicks dressing room and emerged on the court. Broadcasters Chris Schenkel and Jack Twyman was on the call.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm Chris Schenkel, and my colleague on the NBA Game of the Week and in this playoff series, Jack Twyman. And Jack, 19,500 fans here in New York City have yet to see Willis Reed at this hour of the evening.
That is very critical. We heard Red Holzman say he expected him to start. We just had an announcement from the press row that Willis has just received 200 cc of cortisone. Now, I've had cortisone myself, and I think we see Willis coming out.
There he comes right now. 6'10" from Grambling, the captain of the Knicks, the most valuable player of the NBA. It's a standing ovation at the new Madison Square Garden. This is a 38 sellout crowd, and they have been reacting to their Knickerbockers the same way all season long.
New York Knicks fans were absolutely beside themselves as their captain and MVP, Willis Reed, began going through his warm-ups. And as the game began, fans began to question on how effective Willis would be against Chamberlain. The answer would soon come to them very quickly.
To get off the floor. Now it's Garrett who has the ball for Los Angeles, number 20. Number 22 is Elgin Baylor. Guarded by DeBusschere, and Baylor's shot is short. It's taken by Bill Bradley, then a pass break to Walt Frazier. Frazier then slows it down, is picked up by Jerry West at the top of the post. Reed. Willis Reed scores the first bucket here tonight, and New York leads.
After hitting his first shot, the Knicks found Willis again.
And the Lakers, as they were Monday night in that upset win by New York, are standing around trying to get the ball into Chamberlain so he can try Willis Reed.
And Reed now is outside. There's his second shot. He is 2 for 2. Willis Reed. Look at him lift the opposite end of the court, trying to stay with Chamberlain.
That would be the only points Reed would score. With the emotional return of Reed and Clyde Frazier playing one of the greatest finals games of all time, scoring 36 points with 19 assists, the Lakers had little chance. Reed was also effective on Chamberlain on defense, limiting him to just 2 shots in 9 attempts from the field. When Reed left the game for the final time with 3 minutes and 5 seconds remaining in the first half, the Knicks held a 24-point lead. When it was all over, the Knicks had denied the Lakers once again of a world championship, and the Knicks finally claimed their first NBA title with a 113-99 victory in Game 7. Following the game, in the winner's locker room, A moved Howard Cosell standing between Willis Reed and Coach Red Holzman told Reed on national television, quote, "You exemplify the very best that the human spirit can offer." And that, ladies and gentlemen, was this week's main event. Welcome back to the show, and before we get on with the rest of the show, one sign that we are growing here at Historically Speaking Sports and the Sports History Network is we have a sponsor that is newspapers.com. If you're listening to this podcast, you're probably a serious sports fan like me, and if you're into sports history, you need to check out newspapers.com. At newspapers.com, you can get access to over 640 million pages worth of news from the United States, Canada, England, Scotland, Ireland, and so many more countries dating back from the 1700s till yesterday. Get one free week subscription to newspapers.com by visiting sportshistorynetwork.com/newspapers. And with a paid subscription, you'll also be helping support the production of this and other Sports History Network shows. That's sportshistorynetwork.com/newspapers. Also, please check out our Twitter feed here at Historically Speaking Sports, which is Historically SP2, for your daily dose of sports history. Also, you could drop a line or two at our email, which is historically.speaking.sports@gmail.com. And finally, don't forget to hit the subscribe button wherever you hear this podcast so you can get new episodes every week. And now, this week's Top 5. And welcome back to this week's Top 5. And if you're new to the program, what we do here in the Top 5 is to illustrate the top 5 events that happened in this week in history. So this week, we're going to be taking a look at the significant sports moments that took place between the dates of May the 2nd and May the 8th throughout all of history. And this week includes 2 teams battling it out for a league championship that were known as the Pittsburgh Pipers and the New Orleans Buccaneers. We're also going to take a look at a runner in England doing something that was said that humans couldn't do. And finally, the sun that finally set on the Celtic Dynasty. Starting things off in number 5. This week in 1968, the Pittsburgh Pipers, led by Sweet Charlie Williams, dropped 35 points and defeated the New Orleans Buccaneers 122-113 in the 7th game of the inaugural ABA Finals. Future Hall of Famer Connie Hawkins also chipped in for 24 points for the Pipers in the championship finale. Future Hall of Fame coaches Doug Moe and Larry Brown, who were both players for the New Orleans Buccaneers, were contributors, as Moe would lead the Buccaneers, that is, with 28 points in the losing effort in Game 7. That was the 1968 ABA Finals, the very first ABA Finals. Number 4, there are long shots. And then there was Leicester City in the British Premier League of Soccer. This week in 2016, the Leicester City Foxes claimed their biggest league title in British football when Tottenham blew a 2-0 lead against Chelsea and ending in a draw. That decision gave Leicester City the Premier League title. The Foxes, as they are known as, entered the season with 5,000 to 1 odds to win the Premier League. To put that in perspective, this year's Jacksonville Jaguars odds to win the Super Bowl are just 500 to 1. Number 3, this week in 1972, the Lakers, the aforementioned Lakers, finally get their first NBA championship as the Los Angeles Lakers, after moving to LA in 1960 and avenging their loss in 1970 to the New York Knicks, winning the series 4-1. It would be Jerry West's first and only title as a player and the second for Wilt Chamberlain. Number 2. This week in 1969, the curtain finally sets on the Celtic Dynasty. In Bill Russell's final game as a player with the Celtics, he would claim his 11th championship, beating the Lakers 108-106 in Game 7 at the Forum. And the number one sports moment of this week, they said it couldn't be done, and if someone did it, they could possibly die. But Roger Bannister proved that it could be done, and he didn't die from it. This week in 1954, Bannister, a runner from England, became the first runner to run a sub-4-minute mile, and a record some said would never be achieved. The meet taking place at Iffley Road Track in Oxford, England, Bannister recorded a time of 3 minutes, 59.4 seconds. Side note to this record, it only lasted for 46 days. And that concludes this week's Top 5. And coming up next, we're going to wrap things up with this week's shout out. And this one I remember very fondly. Stay tuned. Finally, we're back with this week's shout out, and this week we're going to be talking about the team that put together one of the greatest postseason runs of not only the decade of the 90s, but also one of the best postseason runs in NBA history and nearly shocked the world twice. The 1994 Denver Nuggets finished the season with a record of 42-40 in 1994 and claimed the 8th spot in the postseason that year on the last day of the regular season. Coached by former player and All-Star Dan Issel, the Nuggets were not expected to do much in the playoffs. It was their first appearance in the playoffs in 4 years, and they had one of the youngest rosters in the NBA. The Nuggets were led by a trio of young stars that were still developing in the NBA after stellar college careers. At center was Dikembe Mutombo, also known as Mount Mutombo affectionately by the Nuggets fans. He was just in his 3rd year out of Georgetown. And at point guard was Mahmoud Abdul-Rauf, better known as Chris Jackson while he was at LSU, who was the catalyst of an offense that averaged right at 100 points per game. And the third star was a high-flying scorer by the name of Alfonso Ellis out of Notre Dame. Ellis was in his 2nd year and averaged a shade over 15 points per game, but was one of the most athletic forwards in the league. Along with young stars, the Nuggets had a cast of veteran players that gave leadership, like with the likes of Reggie Williams, Bryant Stith, and Tom Hammonds. Their reward for getting the last spot in the Western Conference playoffs, they would open the postseason against the Seattle Supersonics, coached by George Karl and led by Gary Payton, Sean Kemp, and Detlef Schrempf, all of them perennial All-Stars. The Sonics had posted the league best 63-19 record, and the Nuggets lost the first 2 games of the series expectedly. Yet upon arriving in Denver, the Nuggets used the shot blocking presence of Mutombo to match up with the Sonics, along with career performances by Brian Williams, Reggie Williams, and Robert Pack. The Nuggets eventually would even the series. The series went back to Seattle for a 5th game, and the Nuggets would rally the tie the game and force overtime. In overtime, the Nuggets would emerge with a 4-point win, 98-94, and become the first 8th-seeded team to beat a number 1 seed. In an on-court camera shot is featured Dikembe Mutombo at the end of the game in jubilation, laying on his back, holding the ball after the buzzer sounded. As becoming the first 8th-seeded team to beat a top seed was an outstanding achievement. Heck, maybe even a miracle. But the miracle actually was yet to come. There was little time for celebration as the Nuggets would turn around to face their arch rivals, the Utah Jazz, in the Western Conference semifinals. The Jazz had pulled off a minor upset themselves, beating the favorite San Antonio Spurs 3-1 in the opening round of their playoff series. Utah had entered the postseason as a 5th seed with a solid 53-29 record, led by the devastating duo of John Stockton and Karl Malone. In the second round, the Nuggets struggled in their first 3 games to the 5th-seeded Utah Jazz. Yet, despite the threat of elimination and down 3-0, the Nuggets would rally and win the next 3 consecutive games and to force a Game 7 back in Salt Lake City. They became the first team since the 1951 New York Knicks to force a Game 7 after losing the first 3 games of a 7-game series. The dream of shocking the world again was not to be, unfortunately, for Denver. Led by Karl Malone's 31 points, ended the Nuggets' dream of a postseason run, losing 91-81 at the Delta Center. The Jazz postseason would end as well, losing to the eventual champion Houston Rockets 4-1 in the Western Conference Finals. And that will conclude this week's show, and thanks for listening in. And don't forget to follow us on Twitter at HistoricallySP2, and also hit that subscribe button wherever you listen to podcasts. Once again, I'm Dana Augusta, and talk to you later on the other side of history.
We here at the Sports History Network proudly partner with 26 podcasts, all revolving around the history of sports. But did you know that many of our hosts were sports history authors way before they started their shows? It's true. We've got Joe Ziemba, host of When Football Was Football, Joe Zagurski, host of Pro Football in the 1970s, Mark Morthier, host of Yesterday's Sports, Tommy Phillips, host of Lombardi Memories, and Scott Adamson, co-host of From the 55-Yard Line. All these authors have many books for you to choose from. To check them out, go to our website at sportshistorynetwork.com/sportshistorybooks. Pick up your copy today. Soundtrack provided by Kevin MacLeod of filmmusic.io.